thank you for tuning in to the Logic of God podcast. I'm Cody.
I'm Gina.
And I'm Ben.
If you're returning, thank you for coming back. And if you are a new guest, welcome.
Do you guys think this discussion is different for men versus women in terms of moral relativism?
As a woman, and knowing Cody very well, and Cody is an exception for a couple of reasons. One, he's an introverted extrovert. So I've seen him be extremely introverted, but I've also...
Law of non-contradictions.
Yeah, it's weird.
Gina.
I know. He can turn the switch on and off really easily. I'm worse at that. But Cody's very good at knowing what he believes and sticking to it, but asking really good questions. And men I've seen be like less emotional and less concerned with personal emotional gratification than women are. And that's just my experience in marriage and mentoring married couples. That I could be wrong. I'm willing to be wrong, but I do think women are more concerned with the emotional side. And that's why I gave that warning at the beginning of the episode about not being mastered by your emotions, but actually taking control of those. Because we, as women, have this very strong desire for validation and personal gratification and feeling secure. And it can be a major trap to us. And that's evident in some of the ways that culturally, we're seeing the church go, but also we're just seeing society, like Western society go. And like some examples of that right now, I talked about fast fashion. That's one, but there's also like different little catchphrases that women use. So the biggest one that I've seen in the last 5 years is my truth. It's this like spin on like sharing your story, but like my truth as opposed to the truth's truth. It's saying perception is reality. It's saying my experience is the truth. You could be telling the truth. You might not be lying or misconstruing the truth, but that doesn't mean that it aligns with God's truth. And by saying my truth, we're putting this kind of like twisted spin on what absolute truth is. And it gets murky and it's really hard to navigate because then you're going through somebody else's personal experience that you've never experienced. And you have to have empathy and compassion and love, but it doesn't make it morally true. And you can easily get canceled for not agreeing with that. It's very tricky. Another one is like this idea of self-care and self-love. One of the pieces of advice I was given before I met Cody, I had been in a domestic violence environment and I was connected to a shelter that had like emotional like counseling services for victims. And one of the things that they told me as a healing process was that I needed to learn how to love myself before looking for a new relationship. And that's culturally very relevant. This idea like you have to love yourself and you have to know yourself and connect with yourself and spoil yourself and treat yourself. And it's also very slippery because if you love yourself too much, then you don't leave any room for loving the Lord and knowing the Lord and reflecting the Lord into the world. So it's just not something that I think I don't think it's a valid statement in building relationships with others or with ourselves. In fact, I would rather loathe myself and know that I'm being refined because I love God and have the mind of Christ and the conviction of the Holy Spirit telling me I need to do better than look at myself in the mirror and be like, I'm so awesome. I don't know. Maybe that makes me unhealthy, but I do swing in extremes a little bit with that because I have loved myself above God and I have lived that life and I did not enjoy the repercussions of that spiritually. And then the last one I would list is probably just I did my best. Women who say I did my best use it as an excuse when they've failed. And I know that's a generalization, but I'll give you an example if you want.
Sure.
So I grew up, I was adopted out of the foster care system as a baby, and I was adopted into a family that became broken when I was 2. So my adopted dad left, and I was raised by a single mom. Her excuse for every single thing that went wrong was, I did my best. She put us into a counseling environment at a very young age that was abusive. And her excuse was, I was just trying my best. I didn't know. Her excuse for neglecting us and me having to take care of my siblings and feed my siblings and just do a lot of things, have a lot of responsibilities that I shouldn't have had as a child. Her excuse was always, I did my best. And there's a lot of like little reels on Instagram right now where it's somebody will post, I just want you to know you're doing your best. And there'll be like clouds and a sunset and it'll be beautiful. And everybody will comment, oh, I needed to hear that today. Like, people who say I did my best are the reason why I am who I am. And I have the trauma that I have. Her doing her best was not her best. My mom doing her best was not doing her best. And it created broken children that are trying desperately in their adult lives to pick up the pieces of the damage that she caused, both spiritually and emotionally. Saying that you did your best is an excuse. If you're not doing your best, that's okay. But saying that you did your best gives yourself an excuse to stop trying harder. And that's why she and I don't have a relationship, because she's not willing to try harder to respect the boundaries that I've set now as an adult to protect myself, which I couldn't do as a child. So all of these different sayings really focus on worship of self instead of worship of God. And if we understand the true meaning of worship and we understand absolute truths as a Christian, none of these things align with Christ's calling for our lives, especially as women. And if you look at women in the Bible that lived godly lives, both in the Old and New Testament, you'll see that they were not focused inward. Mary Magdalene wasn't looking in the mirror saying, I did my best and I need to love myself. She was hated. She was reviled. She was scared. And she went out and served the Lord. You look at people like Joanna, she disobeyed her husband, funded most of Jesus's ministry. Then you look at people in the Bible like the Proverbs 31 woman. She wasn't sitting inside of her house doing her makeup and putting jewels in her hair. She was out there hustling, making money for her husband, making sure that servants and slaves were clothed, having babies, doing all of the things that she needed to do to tend to the land. There is no example in the Bible of a woman being like, I love myself. And if there is, it's Jezebel. And if you have the Jezebel spirit, then we should talk. Please email me, because I would love to ask you all about that. But really, it's not a good thing if you're a moral relativist and a Christian woman. It doesn't mesh. That's my spiel.
No, the truth claim of Jesus saying, I am the way, truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me, abolishes any idea of moral relativism. You can't have that truth statement and also be morally relative.
And if you're in a group of women as a Christian that's, girl, give yourself grace. You're doing your best. Like, I'm so happy that you have friends that love you and want to support you, but look for some friends that are going to be like, girl, do better.
So what do you think brought on this mentality? Do you think that it's always been there and it's just clearer today? Or is there something different now?
There's a book called Eve in Exile. It's a really good book, I think, even for men to read to understand feminism and where it started. Feminism is something that has always been a hot topic, I think, throughout the generations of the world, but especially in the last 200 years. And if you read Eve in Exile, you'll understand politically and socioeconomically the value of getting women out of the house and children into schools. There were a lot of narratives that were created that made women feel empowered because their husbands were the breadwinners. And you'll see statistically how fathers became less present and women had to step up into the role of being both mother and father and provider. There are so many cultural statistics in America to prove that. To have a society validate a woman who is like killing herself to provide for her family because she is the only provider, and then having programs implemented for these women who needed support, it created this environment where now we're seeing like baby boomers, especially a lot of them dealt with single motherhood. And then my generation, like our generation, that was, I think, the height of single parenthood ever in history. And we were born in like the 80s and 90s. So for women, it feels validating. And you have men who have all of this power. Politically, they have power. In the workplace, they have power. And even in female-driven markets, like makeup and clothing, it's still male-dominated. And so it feels very validating. It feels refreshing. It feels good. And women never really had that. It was expected. Like, you're going to stay home, you're going to have your family, you're going to raise your children, you're going to do the things at home that you need to do. And now it's, oh, I can make a lot of money. Oh, I can get a lot of attention. Oh, my body has value monetarily and visually that can get me places as an influencer. So there are all of these shifts that have happened that were designed, and they were not designed by God. There's even within the church a lot of argument on women in ministry. Like, should women be pastors? Should women be elders? Should women teach at all outside of like children's ministry? All of these arguments, even inside of the church, have made women question their role in society. And I don't know, Cody and I were doing this study this week about like interpretation. There are certain verses in the Bible about women that were interpreted in a certain way because of culture. And it's accepted still today. And it's not necessarily true according to biblical Hebrew. You get into feminism, you get into all of the traps from politics, and then it becomes, oh, I can have this power and I can do whatever I want. And it doesn't matter. I can show my ankles and my shoulders.
Do you think some of this issue with moral relativism has developed out of an active attempt to remove consequence from actions?
I don't think women would agree with that. I think women would say that is true for men, but not for women. And I think that's just another evidence of moral relativism.
I'm not asking women generally. I'm asking you. And yes, as a woman, still, is that what you think? Do you think part of it is an attempt to remove consequence, and a success? Because it doesn't, both for men and for women, I would say that many of the things that we would consider to be consequences in the past, such as an unwanted pregnancy that would keep two people together, cause a shotgun wedding in Vegas or something like that, like things that people used to do because having a baby outside of wedlock was dishonorable. It used to be something that was just taken as read. You would do it. You have a duty to your parents to not shame them. You have a duty to the child, and you can't just kill the child. That would be absurd. But now there's no duty to your parents because your parents don't care. It's like, and why would you even care about them? And again, this is for both men and women, but we are talking about the female perspective and an interpretation of a removal of consequence. Do you think that an active removal of consequence is contributing to this?
If you're not afraid of the consequences from your family for making decisions that are not good, it snowballs culturally. An unwanted pregnancy, like I was a teen mom, so getting pregnant at 18, I got excommunicated from my family for a while. And there were supports in my society that enabled me to cohabitate with the baby's father and have financial support from the government. And so it does enable people to live a certain lifestyle that's not honoring. But moral consequence, unless you're a Christian, moral consequence is irrelevant. I wasn't worried about people judging me in the church because I wasn't in the church. So I didn't have any accountability. I was surviving.
Kind of removing the emotional element out of this for a second. Thomas Sowell is a very famous economist and historian, and you could consider him a philosopher. But he's written a number of different books covering the subject in a number of different ways. And he had an argument, actually a series of arguments on a number of different shows. Like he was on William F. Buckley's show quite often back in the day. And back when the black family specifically was something that he was passionate about because he himself was black and he was looking at the degradation of the poor black families in the United States. He pointed out back when it was 15% fatherlessness rates for black children, as in 15% of black children were born out of wedlock to a single mother family. He said at that time, which was decades ago now, that was unacceptable, and that would continue to lead to a moral degradation where things would get worse and worse, and it would be a continuing snowball effect, and not just for the black community, but for all communities. At this stage, what we see is that 1 out of every 3 children in the U.S., regardless of what race you are, is born to a single mother. If you break it down by race, it gets significantly worse. It's 75% in the black community now, and 50% of all black children are aborted. Those are heartbreaking statistics. Again, to try to remove the emotion out of it for just a second, just looking at the raw numbers, it's clear that something is happening, that there is an attempt to remove the morality, like the moral consequence, the moral question, and to just focus on what it is that we want. And to say that there's no consequence for that, and not that you were saying that, Gina, but a lot of people today try to say that there are no consequences to abortion or no consequences to just having sex with whoever you want, hookup culture. There are serious consequences to that.
One example I think of this is like the most recent current event in America where there were like college and university students protesting the war between Palestine and Israel. And when you have people who have never experienced war, or they have never really experienced a type of hardships that they're upset about, then of course they have this grand drama in their mind of what they expect and what they want. And it's very important and very critical. But then if you look at the statistics of Americans that are homeless, food insecure, don't have running water, are dealing with domestic violence, are dealing with fatherlessness, single parenthood, being unemployed, struggling to pay their bills, there is a war happening stateside that people are just trying to get by in. And they're not as concerned with morality because they're more concerned with survival. In my experience, evangelism has meant more for me to step out and just acknowledge that disparity or that struggle in my community than for me to arbitrarily stand on a green somewhere and protest. I think moral relativism has gotten so grand and dramatic that we forget that there's just things that are affecting our communities and our societies locally that we should be focusing on more. And I think that's a trap from the enemy. Hey, focus here, look here, not here. And then people get left behind. And that's such an opportunity for Christians, because if we can give them the truth in love, then we can withdraw them from moral relativism and cancel culture. And even if we can't solve all of their problems, we can set them back on a path that leads towards fruitful marriage and respect for other people and love and the things that Christ has to offer us. It's very challenging to be in a society where moral relativism is creating these protests, and these colleges are relying on moral relativism to punish students for being unlawful, but they feel guilty for doing it because who are they to judge the righteousness and morality of a person for breaking and entering?
Well, and to be fair, I don't think the point you're trying to make is that you have to have an opinion on everything and work on everything before you can have an opinion on something like Israel-Palestine. I think there are a lot of people who just have the wisdom of current thing. As in, there is the loudest voices in the crowd are shouting about something. And so they immediately go to, oh, that's the thing I care the most about. And I'm signaling to everyone else I'm a good person by caring about the current thing. Mm-hmm. Most people who are shouting really loud about these things, they don't know anything about them. Prior to a few months ago, they had never heard of Israel or Palestine, really. And even if they did hear about them, they knew almost nothing about them. And at this point, they still don't know, because when they chant from the river to the sea, they don't realize what they're talking about is literally the entirety of Israel belonging to Hamas.
If we look at stories in the Bible of people crying out for help to Jesus, typically it was in the midst of a noisy, chaotic crowd screaming about other things. and somebody quietly reached out to Jesus. Amidst the screaming, there are whispers. And I think moral relativism and this just like woke culture is canceling these whispers of people who genuinely need morality and need absolute truth. And it's perpetuating these curses in our own communities.
So we wandered a little bit in and out of the subject there. We never really addressed how this affects men specifically. Like we've got a little bit of an interplay there, a little bit of a bleed over between us. And obviously we can't fully separate ourselves. Is there any way that this affects men uniquely as opposed to women, moral relativism?
Do what feels good.
Yeah, it's just, it gives into ego and pride, which I think men struggle with more so than women. And that's a generalization, but.
What about porn? I'm not hurting anybody.
Yeah.
It's between me and my computer.
Yes, I think the subject of moral relativism affects men a great deal differently in the sexual realm. Because one, the consequence for men having sex is not the same for women. It just isn't. In any sense, even if there's no pregnancy that happens.
The chemical response is completely different.
Absolutely. So for the small number of men who are actively just constantly having sex in the American culture, I do think it affects them very differently. There is that justification, I'm wanted. These women want it. I want it. It's not hurting me.
It's consensual, and therefore it is okay.
The nature of the consent discussion is that everything is okay provided there is consent. One, that's not moral relativism because you're still saying that consent is the important thing. But it is still a quasi-application of the principle because it means you can do whatever you want provided there's consent.
Yeah, it's mutually good for everybody. Therefore, it's good. Even though there is no good or bad.
And if you're watching porn, then it doesn't involve another person at all. And that's even more harmless, right?
It creates a slippery slope. And this is what the whole, at the beginning of all of this moral relativist stuff is the LGBTQ community leading into pedophilia being okay. Because I'm born that way. It's my truth. It's how I am. Now there's like AI generated stuff for these perverts, and it's that mentality. It's not real. It's not hurting anybody, so it's okay.
And in many ways, that's an attempt to bypass the objection that as far as like creator manufactured pornography that involves actors or actresses or models or whatever, there absolutely is a victim in that. Even if you have women coming in voluntarily doing these things and men voluntarily coming in and doing these things graphically on camera, these people are not okay. Like how many interviews have we seen at this point of people who used to be involved and thank God came to the Lord, but you can't just walk away from that life.
I knew a girl when I got pregnant with Madeline. I knew a girl that did pornography and she got pretty famous. And she ended up leaving the industry and getting a job in a local restaurant. And she got sexually assaulted and she got sexually harassed all the time because people recognized her. And she would go home like sobbing. And so many times the police got called because people thought that she was just sleazy and easy. And they wanted to take advantage of that. And that was not what she wanted. You have to understand the industry that you're trying to justify.
It's not a victimless situation.
No.
Just because it was consensual, just because someone signed on to do these awful acts in front of a camera, and you're supporting it with your money. And I get it. As men, like we have a fire in our blood. I understand that. That doesn't make it okay. I get it. We have that compulsion. And I think that does lend to this distinction. There are men involved in the production of pornography. As far as the people who are in front of the camera, it tends to be, oddly enough, that both men and women are watching women for different reasons, but it still tends to be women who are the ones exploited in front of the camera. Men tend to be the people behind the camera.
That makes sense.
Driving it.
Mm-hmm. And it's made mostly for the male appetite, but not always. That's not the point. The point is that it does affect us differently. And just because it affects us differently, let's say, because again, you brought up the idea of AI generated pornography. At that point, there doesn't seem to be any kind of victim. We've bypassed the point where you can say, oh, all right, there's the woman in front of the camera. She's the victim. Now there's no victim. This person doesn't even exist.
We know now that people are using actual children's photos to generate this pornography.
Yes.
Well, even putting aside that, people say it doesn't harm anything. There has never been a time in society where there has been so much male ED under 25 ever. Mm-hmm. And that's happening because of porn, because of the desensitization to what sex was designed to do.
Yeah. Before, Gina, like a while ago in a different episode, you mentioned hedonic adaptation.
Yes, I was just going to bring that up.
Please explain.
No, thank you. Hedonic adaptation is just a fancy psychology word for an escalating threshold of pleasure or gratification. And so once you start at a starting point, where you started is never good enough. It always has to escalate. That's human nature. And it's great in some instances because humans are very adaptable. But when it comes to things that are like sinful or hedonistic, it can become very dangerous very quickly, because what started out as like just watching two people have regular sex becomes spicy sex. And then it becomes dangerous, like dubious consent kind of stuff. And it just becomes very toxic, and it escalates very quickly. And if you don't reset yourself, like knowing that we have that hardwired in our brains as humans, you're going to fall prey to it and become its victim instead of taking yourself captive there.
Mm-hmm. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that these AI generated images are just creating purely novel people that don't exist, and they're not pulling from material that did exploit somebody. In fact, we talked about the sex trade not that long ago. Who do you think is involved in the production of some of this? In fact, a significant portion of pornography. But getting away from that, let's just say that somehow you're able to generate images that, or even in full videos now, that don't involve any real people. What's the harm in that?
You're putting yourself in a situation where you might be able to see now visually something that no human being would ever agree to. I'm not even going to get into details, just because this is supposed to be generally a non-explicit, but
family-friendly-ish.
Sort of. But you could, in theory, create something that no human being would ever consent to. And how do you come back from that?
Leading to yourself to more and more twisted fantasies, like you talked about, Gina. Mm-hmm. And even again, for the sake of argument, let's say you don't go down that route and you just watch tons of standard sex between various people who don't exist, making it the most stomachable, I guess you could say, version of events, where you're not doing anything terribly twisted, just watching people who don't exist have sex. And that's all you're doing.
If you've committed adultery in your mind, you've committed adultery.
Yes. It's if you're not married yet. Are you doing this faithfully to your future wife? No, you're not being faithful to her. You, according to the Bible, you are cheating on her. And let's say you don't believe in the Bible. You think that's all hogwash. It doesn't matter.
Because you've got presuppositions in your mind now of what your wife is supposed to be, and she's going to disappoint you.
You have the thing in your heart you want, and you have wanted it from women who are not your wife. And you have gotten it from women who are not your wife, who literally don't exist. There was a show that I watched with my mom that she really likes. It was an English show. It's not exactly a soap opera, I don't think I'd call it. But it was one of those very dramatic women type shows. This, got tons of scandals in it and whatnot.
Days of our lives.
But there was this one line that I thought fit so incredibly well. It hit so hard. There was this woman who was marrying this man, and they didn't really love each other, but this woman was asking, "Do you love me?" And the man says, "You'll do."
Oh, no.
And that hits so hard. And she said, "What do you mean?" He said, "We're both getting older. We don't really have that many more options. We don't have that much time."
Don't you dare judge me, Lizzie.
No, don't even put this on that. Pride and Prejudice is beautiful.
Yes, but she marries him, and he's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's exactly that concept.
Sorry.
It's you'll do. When you're consuming that measure of pornography, when that is the desire of your heart to have sex with as many women as possible, your wife, because she's the only woman in this world who will actually be with you physically, she'll do.
Could you imagine being married to that? I'd roll over in the morning and be like, man, you're so adequate.
I'd be with an infinite number of other people if I could, but since you're the only one here, like, how are you supposed to build a life with that person? How's your wife supposed to feel about that? It is infidelity, even if you're not doing it. And it doesn't matter if you look at things through a biblical worldview.
And that is totally evidenced by what Cody said with erectile dysfunction and just all of the problems that are taking place in the bedroom for American families.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we did a lot of statistics on one of the Catching Foxes episode, but I can't remember all of them. But it's crazy the effect of porn that you don't think about.
It's like the argument like marijuana is not a gateway drug. That's a very common thing because people are legalizing marijuana all over the United States and lobbying for it and running businesses for it. And nobody wants you to believe that it's a gateway drug. Statistically speaking, marijuana is absolutely a gateway drug because 46% of people who use marijuana go on to using harder things because we have hedonic adaptation, which means that we're constantly justifying going harder because we want a bigger high.
That's why ODs exist.
Now, this episode was not specifically supposed to be on drugs or sex or anything like that. Obviously, we do have positions on all of those things. And I think by now you probably know our positions on most of them.
We're prudes.
Yes, very much. And I'm proud of it.
Yes.
I'm a perfectly proud prude.
And don't you dare judge me.
Don't you dare judge me, Lizzie. But tying this back into the idea of moral relativism, the reason we have these strong stances on these various subjects we've even covered in other episodes is because there are clear consequences. One of the reasons we can see that moral relativism is nonsense, leaving aside the laws of reason and the reality that the Bible tells us in great detail on a large number of subjects what the right thing is, leaving all that aside, living it out. If you didn't have access to the Bible itself, we can see the consequences of our action played out in the world. Our ideologies manifest in the world as fate. I don't remember who it was that said that, but when we believe something genuinely, if you genuinely believe that morality is purely relative, then it doesn't matter what you do, and thus that's the way you will act, as if nothing you do matters, and so nothing you do will.
If you are afraid of being called a bigot as a Christian, or you're justifying certain behaviors or surrounding yourself with secular things that you know contradict what you say you believe, there should be some accountability there. And I don't want this episode to be like bashing pop culture and modern society and feminism. I don't want that. My platform on a podcast teaching with my husband, if I was by myself, a lot of people would probably tell me to sit down and shut up in the church. Even probably with my husband, people would say that. So I'm not trying to set women back. I'm not trying to invalidate the progress that's been made for women because it's significant. But like, we do need to evaluate constantly our surroundings, not just because we should leave, but because we should stand up for what is true. And we should know ourselves what is absolute.
Yes. Honestly, this discussion, our listener base is not mostly atheists and moral relativists. So this is to teach and identify what's happening in our churches in America today, because this is very real and has been adopted by a lot of people who call themselves Christians. And as Gina just mentioned, if you're not standing up on truth, then you're not really standing for God. And it should scare you when you come to Judgment Day and you say, Lord, there could be a possibility that he says that he never knew you because when he was hungry, you didn't feed him. When he was cold, you didn't clothe him. And that should scare you because that's a very real thing. And taking no moral standpoint is not a good thing inside the church.
I heard this story recently of this woman who was an addict, and she found out she was pregnant, and she realized the day that she found out she was pregnant that she had a problem. And in that recognition, she realized that she was doing something against her will that hurt her body and hurt her baby. And she shared this story about how she had gotten high on drugs that somebody had given her and they had misled her. And so she had used a drug she didn't know she was using and had a very bad reaction. And she remembered falling on her knees while high and pregnant and just begging God to help her. And I think we have to remember that God loves those people so much and they are so precious to him. And the fact that in the height of her sin and shame, she went to him on her knees means so much to God. There are people who are making decisions based in moral relativism that are so lost and so hungry and thirsty for eternity, and they are replacing it with things that make them feel good right now because they're seeking. And if we can acknowledge that seeking and love them like Jesus, it will have such a grand impact on society. And it takes gentleness and humility and patience and knowing that we don't control the outcome of what we've shared, but that we've stepped up and been obedient to share. We should never be openly hating and condemning people to hell, especially the lost. That's up to Jesus, but we can share with them and minister to them in powerful ways through compassion. And moral relativism is a cry for help. It's not something that we should laugh at and judge and then walk away from.
So closing out this episode, I think there's one more question we need to answer. How do we address moral relativism in the church itself? Because it is definitely growing in the church, and it manifests in different ways, in weird ways you wouldn't even think it would. But attempts to try to tell everybody that we need to focus on the love of God and not the justice, not the judgment, and focus purely on the Jesus who hugged the babies and saved the adulterous woman from being stoned. How do we address that?
It's really hard for me to answer this question because I have a lot of church hurt and I have a hard time trusting church leadership because of bad advice and flippant comments that have been made when I have brought up some of these issues. I think the first step is setting the example consistently. You can't ask somebody to do something you're not willing to do yourself.
You hear it constantly in the church now, and you mentioned the love aspect, but also people say, I'm saved by grace, and use that as an excuse to live however they want to. I have love, I have grace, and I'm good. But if that grace and that love is not driving you to be more holy, then something is dramatically wrong.
What is a person's gauge of their holiness?
How set apart are you? That's what holy means. You're set apart. You're set apart from the world. If your church looks like the world, you're not holy. If you look like the world, you're not holy.
But I feel like that's such a slippery slope, Cody, because then you run into people who are like, I'm so holy. And they like lord it over people. There are Christians that give the church a bad name because of that. So how do you balance it?
You're not to call yourself up. Like the people who are, I'm so holy, are doing it because they're trying to prove a point in themselves. It's pride in them, telling them to say, be like me. That should never be the Christian's objective. It should be like Jesus.
Yeah, but Paul said, be like me and I'm like Jesus.
That's another discussion for another day. I don't agree with that statement.
But I've literally heard that in multiple churches. I'm just pointing out things that I've heard.
They're not living like Paul. They're not. We are told that if we're living like Christ, we are going to be hated by this world. I don't know a lot of Christians who are hated by this world.
What do you think, Ben?
When Paul is talking about how you should be like him, you also have to keep in mind that Paul was a man who suffered. And you're absolutely right, Cody. He's a man who suffered a lot. And there was a point where he listed out his various sufferings. And he even says, I'm out of my mind to talk like this. But he was being very real with his audience. He was listing out all the things that he'd done for the sake of Christ. And everything that he lost, he count as gain for the sake of the Almighty. And that is what he's saying when you should live like him. You should live as if everything that you have, every ounce of suffering that you take, it doesn't matter. It's okay. Everything that you had before, you counted as loss for the sake of Christ. You give everything up. Be that way. Paul knew who he was and where he stood. And you should know where you are and where you stand. As far as the people who have this kind of moral superiority, like Frollo from The Hunchback of Notre Dame, talking about how great you are and how miserable the rest of the world is. One, I don't find a lot of people who take that position these days because of how well they adhere to the law. That's something that the people of Jesus's time did absolutely do. And Jesus had a lot of very strong words for those people, putting on enormous burdens on people that they wouldn't dare lift a finger to help. Those people do exist. They did exist. But that doesn't seem to be the problem we're facing in society today. That attitude does still exist, but it seems to be from people who don't even live according to the law, who don't even live according to Christ. There is a measure of pride that we take in the idea of combating our own selfish desires, in the fact that we don't struggle the same way as other people do. And we've talked about this before. There's an element of living in the church, having grown up my whole life, where I haven't struggled with certain things. That doesn't make me automatically virtuous. It means I never struggled with them to begin with. But as I've grown older and interacted more and more with other people who have struggled, it's not that I am better than them. There's an element of struggle and pain that has developed as I've gotten older and other things have happened to me. And so I haven't been given a painless life. The pain that I've suffered comes from outside rather than inside. But there are a lot of people who've made bad decisions, and there's an enormous amount of internal suffering they have to deal with. And you shouldn't consider yourself a superior person because you don't suffer that internal suffering, that internal issue that never fully goes away. An alcoholic is never truly cured. They only go through periods of sobriety, and hopefully they can last that for the rest of their life. Like my dad took me a few times to celebrate recovery, and that's something that's very clear for a lot of people. There's always the possibility of falling back in. And with that comes the clarity that Christ is necessary.
It's the same idea as you've never arrived. If you get to the point in your faith where you're like, man, I made it. Look at me. Mm-hmm. No.
But I think we've become so afraid of becoming those moral busybodies as a collective in the church, of not being judgmental to people, that we've gone in the polar opposite direction. And we've said, no, we don't feel bad about anything. We're not going to say anything to anyone. We're not going to take positions in anything on issues that were once very clear in the church: homosexuality or abortion or marriage, sex outside of it, pornography, cohabitation. And there are still moral busybodies in the church who will make it very clear their positions on all of these things and won't do it in love, and that's a problem.
So what's the difference between a moral busybody and somebody that has righteous judgment?
You be the guys who are most equipped to answer that question. What would you say is the difference?
Yeah, Cody, what would you say?
Moral busybodies tend to approach salvation from a works-based standpoint, and they take pride in their moral high ground, and I don't think that's right. I don't think we took that high ground. We saw people as people and treated them as such and loved them, called them up, didn't co-sign their sin, called them out of that, but still loved them through the sin.
It's like with Jesus and the adulterous woman. He stopped them from stoning her, but he still said, go forth and sin no more. You guys have done a lot for people who had nowhere else to go. You have. And you guys, I think, have a heart for those people because at one time you were in some pretty dark places yourselves. I think the trouble is that there are a lot of Christians, the Frollos of this world, who never struggled and don't understand why people struggle. You understand the struggle. And so while you understand it's not right to have kids outside of marriage, you understand those people need help, and being called an abomination and stupid and ugly and terrible isn't going to help anyone.
No.
But you were still firm in telling these people what the position was, the thing that was right to do.
I've never met a person who met God for the first time on the mountaintop. And I think if we're going to be righteous in our judgment, we have to establish where a person is in their walk and talk to them like they're actually children of God that are beloved.
What is the biblical position in that? We're told to, if we see, James tells us, if we recognize something as sin and do nothing about it, we're guilty of that sin. What are we called to do? We're called to assist people and make disciples. We're supposed to lead them out of that. Nobody's just going to, you berate them and they're going to come out of their sin. That's not a good way to disciple people. Mm-hmm. What you have to do is get down in the dirt with them, grab them by their bootstraps, pull them out, snatch them from the fire, and lead them to the way of righteousness, not belittle them to the way of righteousness.
You can be sensitive without being condoning it. You don't have to affirm, but you can be very sensitive.
Look at Jesus's ministry. He didn't condone people's sin, but he met people where they were out and showed them the way out of their sin.
And he said to the woman, "Go and sin no more," and left the decision to her. She may have gone out and continued being an adulterous woman because culturally that's all she knew, and it was really hard to break out of that. We don't know, but we have to remember that if it was okay for Jesus to say, "Go and sin no more," and allow her to have the freedom to choose him if it was her choice, we can't wash our hands of people just because they don't like what we have to say. We can't stop what we're saying and doing just because somebody doesn't agree with us, or just because somebody doesn't say the prayer of salvation the first time we told them about Jesus. That's not a sign of failure. You have to understand that success has nothing to do with the other person's decision. At least you are not complicit, and at least you have told them the truth and been a light on a hill for them.
Now, all this advice I think is really solid for the church congregation, the people around you, your brothers and sisters who may be struggling with things, or even people outside the church who are trying to find their way in, but are essentially meeting a stone wall because of the things that they've done. But what about the leadership? What happens when you have leadership in a church that is preaching a version of moral relativism?
I would say that the most insidious part of church leadership isn't even what they're teaching from the pulpit as much as it's what they're consuming at home. It's one thing to misspeak occasionally. It's another thing to mislead. And so if you have a pastor that is not in the word personally and has confessed that, or you have a pastor who has no training whatsoever, but was given a title arbitrarily, which is extremely common. Go ask your church who has an education and is actually a pastor. It's two separate issues. So you have the occasional mistake where you can say, "Man, I really wish you would have explained this better. This is my perspective. Let's talk about it." And they're open to it. The other would be, this is systematic. This is a church that cares more about prosperity gospel, name it and claim it, love and affirmation and acceptance, and even sometimes New Age spirituality hinted. It depends on which direction your church is, but if your church is open to feedback and welcomes that, cool, go give them feedback and tell them where their gaps are, because a lot of times mentorship is hard to find even for pastors, and they need that feedback. But if you have a church systematically that has no fruit and is preaching these things and it doesn't align with scripture, and you've done your evaluation and you've listened to our podcast and you've questioned things and tested things and it doesn't align. If you're in a mega church that sees 50,000 people a week, leave. I don't see a point in trying to change the mind of an organization that doesn't care about the voice of the little person. We were personally told we were too opinionated in that situation, and nothing we said mattered.
No, and that doesn't mean you still can't make impact in the individual outside of leadership. I know we're talking about leadership now, but absolutely that won't affect megachurch leadership. And you can't judge fruit by the number of butts in seats. That's got to stop happening too. Just because a church is large does not mean that God is with it.
They might have really nice drum solos. It's hard to walk away from a church that you love with people that you love, that you've gotten to know. I worked in ministry. Cody is in school for ministry. It is not uncommon for people to just leave, and it is not uncommon for people to get hurt because leadership doesn't like the feedback that they're getting and they're nasty about it. If you've gone through the steps of biblical accountability in a disagreement, which is to inform the person personally and then involve a leader like a pastor or an elder, if you've gone through the steps that are outlined in the Bible for that type of disagreement in the church, and they still will not reconcile with you, or they still will not be open to the possibility that they're doing something wrong to you, they're a Gentile. You leave.
And we covered a lot of that in the How to Find a Church episode, and how to deal with leadership who is not open to correction. And to play the other side, there is a lot of overcriticalness of leadership in the church. You shouldn't be sitting there judging harshly everything that comes out of your pastor's mouth. But if they're clearly not preaching the truth and you've lovingly made that known, then it's probably not the best place for you.
What are you worshiping if you're not worshiping God?
Either yourself or a demon or another human being.
Yeah. We have to be really careful not to put our pastors in the place of God. And we have listeners who don't have access to a church. Mm-hmm. We have to be very careful not to put people on a pedestal. We are all sick with sin.
And let's say that you can't manage to find a church that you agree with. Let's say that you just feel adrift, and no matter where you go, it feels like either you don't agree with a theology, or even worse, that every single church that you go to seems to have been infected with some measure of moral relativism. And to be fair, even amongst mainline Protestant denominations and even non-Protestant, like Catholic and Orthodox denominations, it feels like that's sneaking its way in everywhere. I can understand that feeling, like there's no place you can go. That doesn't mean that you automatically make a church yourself.
No, absolutely not.
But if in the meantime you need something to keep you going, find 2 or 3 people, 4 people, 5 people, a prayer group that you can meet together, go over God's word, pray together, have discussions like what the 3 of us are having right now. In many ways, the 3 of us are somewhat adrift. We don't need to go too much in detail about that, but we've struggled finding a church that feels like home. All 3 of us have. For me, it's been a struggle for a very long time, even with the church I was going to for years, I think over a decade or close to a decade. But now doing this with the 2 of you, it feels like I'm being fed. That doesn't mean it's a substitute for a church.
No.
But where 2 or 3 are gathered in his name, there he is in your midst. And so if you need something to help you through that transitionary time, building your own little community, not your own church, but your own community of people you pray with and you go over the Bible with, and you build one another up as iron sharpens iron, so you sharpen one another. And with Christ in your midst, you pray. You'll still make progress. Just keep looking.
And send us an email.
Please.
If you're not sure where to start, or you have a specific scenario, it's really hard to talk about generalizations and church leadership and conflict and moral relativism, because there are so many directions it can take, and they're all sensitive subjects. If you have a specific case in your church and you don't know what to do, reach out. I can't promise that we have expert opinions, but we can certainly help you pray through it and weed through it and come up with a plan for how you're going to address it.
3 more people praying for your problem.
We would love to pray for you.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to our podcast today. If you liked what you heard, please feel free to subscribe and share and leave a positive review. And if you would like to connect with us on social media, you can do so on Instagram and Facebook at The Logic of God. You can also send us an email at main.thelogicofgod@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening. We hope you have a great day.